Dante's he's trying to go up the mountain to God.
Right.
And he realizes there's three beasts that block his way, and it turns out he's got to go down and learn about his own sin before he can go up. And those kind of tropes, those kind of big stories, I think, have shaped who we are. And if we don't see that and we're just reading poetry as kind of a game or an exercise or something that to pass the time or to write an article about, that's not how we read poetry. And if you think about it, we're not very deep people because I don't think we know how to read poetry anymore, and we don't value it and what it has to offer us.
As a young boy with an overactive imagination and a mind prone to wonder, I stumbled upon the likes of Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, and Robert Frost. Their poems struck me in a way I couldn't quite grasp at the time. It wasn't just the rhythm or the rhyme. It was as if they had unlocked a door I didn't even know existed. Poetry, with its elegant cadence and cryptic insight, handed me a key to life's mysteries. Suddenly, sacrifice, pain, love, conquest, and virtue weren't just words on a page, but vibrant brushstrokes painting the canvas of reality. It gave me a vocabulary for the inexplicable and a vision for the unseen. Life, as I soon realized, is not just a story. It's poetry. It's the subtle crescendo that transforms the mundane into the meaningful, where even silence speaks volumes. Poetry illuminates truth, and in doing so, provokes the pursuit of all that is good. Now fast forward to today, and poetry, like most good things, has been sacrificed on the altar of postmodernism, where nihilists murmur their thoughts and call it art. Gone are the days when poetry shaped civilizations and stirred the hearts of men to action. Today it seems more like a dirge, composed by those unfamiliar with beauty, or worse, allergic to it. What once built kingdoms, now in the hands of the small-minded, is used to tear them down. Yet, not all is lost. Thankfully, God in His providence preserves the pearls of history to teach us lessons that modern fools would rather ignore. The inheritance of poetic majesty is still there for those humble enough to see it. This heritage isn't for the self-satisfied. It's for the broken-hearted pilgrim, with eyes wide open to the glories of beauty, wisdom, and life. Joining me today to talk about this very heritage is Dr. Jayson Grieser, a man who has spent years delving into the richness of poetry's past. Dr. Grizer is a Fellow of Literature at New St. Andrews College, where he has been shaping minds since 2007. He earned his MA and PhD in literature from the University of Dallas, with his doctoral work focusing on the poetry of George Herbert. His work includes Hamlet, a worldview guide, and the co-authored Calvinist poetry, 101 poems from the Calvinist poets. When he's not wrestling with the musings of the long-dead poets, he's husband to Hannah, father to 5 sons, and a grandfather to a cherished granddaughter. Jayson Grieser, welcome to A Flames and Crowns.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here.
Great to be here.
So, as we kick this off, I want to start with an interesting question. Of course, you're in the world of the Christian liberal arts, right? And you teach literature. And in contrast, when you see much of what's offered out there in education, in modern education, it often seems obsessed with novelty, trying to tap into something new, trying to offer some new kind of experience. In contrast, what would you say the value of being acquainted with the old is?
Yeah. The old poets are often trying to take something even before them and update it for their own time.
Right.
So I don't think just reading old things is valuable in itself. But if you can take an old thing and show why it's relevant for today. So like, say, The Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden is a poem where he takes something from Homer and tries to understand his own day. So if we can take, I think Shakespeare's taking old stories, Chaucer's taking old stories and making them relevant for his own time. So So I think it's a mistake if we think poetry is about things that are old. It's really about the universal things that are always timeless. Yeah. And so we need to read old things so we can understand things today. And if we're not seeing the relevance, I think we're missing something very important.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess that would be one of the criticisms. Like, if you're just focusing on ancient texts,
right,
how can you actually be relevant in a modern world?
Maybe that's what's killed classics departments.
Wow.
Because it was more of an academic exercise rather than let's get wisdom for today.
Right.
And that's how we need to read the classics.
Right. So for someone who's really struggling with that and struggles to see how poetry is relevant for today, what sort of things would you tell them to open their minds up to the beauty of ancient texts?
Yeah. Well, one of the ways is to look at how poetry has shaped the men of the past, and how those men then went off and lived these great lives. Poetry makes men, as it said, it kind of trains your emotions, trains your heart.
Yeah.
A couple of examples maybe would be, like in Preface to Paradise Lost, C.S. Lewis pointed out that it was the Aeneid that made men serious and gave us a kind of maturity that we didn't have before. It's basically the story of Abraham told in a secular way, where you're going off and finding this new land, and it's all about adventure and kind of submission to something higher than yourself. So I think, or Dante. Right? Dante's he's trying to go up the mountain to God, and he realizes there's three beasts that block his way, and it turns out he's got to go down and learn about his own sin before he can go up. And those kind of tropes, those kind of big stories, I think, have shaped who we are. And if we don't see that, and we're just reading poetry as kind of a game or an exercise or something that to pass the time or to write an article about, that's not how we read poetry. And if you think about it, we're not very deep people, because I don't think we know how to read poetry anymore, and we don't value it and what it has to offer us.
Yeah. In the cold open, I spoke a little bit about postmodernism and how it's worked very tirelessly trying to diminish quality and diminish art. And I think poetry would be included in that. In what ways have you seen modern poetry be assaulted by, I suppose, a lack of substance, or, just what do you make of modern poetry?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think a lot of us, when we hear the word poetry, we're turned off.
Right.
I would rather go to a doctor's appointment than hear people read modern poetry.
Right.
One of the things I've been struck by recently, I actually went to a poetry reading fairly recently, and it was modern poetry. Very hard to listen to.
Yeah.
I didn't really enjoy much of it. When you read older poets, they tend to write for an audience.
Yeah.
Right? They knew they were good at that, and they used rhyme. We might think, oh, rhyme is for children. Rhyme is not serious, but rhyme makes it accessible.
Absolutely.
And part of it is about memory.
Yeah.
And when you hear a poem that rhymes, you kind of understand the structure.
Yes.
It takes you in. It delights you, and it should delight you and then teach you something. And I think losing rhyme, I've come to realize, is what's maybe cut us off from the accessibility of poetry. So in postmodernism, if we want to discard all the things of the past, we're gonna destroy art. We're gonna destroy poetry, and I think we've done a good job of destroying it.
Yeah.
But if we can recover some of the things that the masters have taught us, but then again, do it in a new way. I have students write poems for my class, not just appreciate poetry, but they have to write 2 poems over the course of 7 weeks. And one of the things I tell them to do is find a poem that you're reading that you enjoy, borrow something from it, and do something new with it.
Yeah.
And if we can do that, and including using rhyme in new ways, using slant rhymes, we've got new words, we can do new things with poetry.
Right.
So we gotta find a way to update it, use it in new ways, and not just like the postmodernists just start throwing stuff out and saying we don't need, we can do our own kind of political art or whatever the ways we're diminishing art, and I think missing these, like you said, these older forms that we can then update and use in new ways. T.S. Eliot said, if you're going to be a serious artist or serious poet, you have to take the past and internalize it, and then update it for your own time. Every generation has to do that.
Amazing. Yeah. That's rich. Now, Jayson, rumor has it that you have befriended George Herbert and John Milton, and that you have become very close to them. And if you wouldn't mind, I would appreciate an introduction to them at some point.
Okay.
What is it about these two poets that really got your attention initially?
Yeah.
What stood out to you about them?
Yeah, I think the first poet that most of us are struck by is Shakespeare. We read, we read Shakespeare in class, and maybe you first read it and you think that's really hard, but there's something profound there, and then maybe you read him again. So in college, I had a class where, this is at the University of Dallas. This is actually in graduate school. We had a class where it was a whole semester. Every week we read a different Shakespeare play.
Wow.
We'd have 3-hour discussions about each one, and that was pretty groundbreaking for me. But then we went on to read the metaphysical poets, which I didn't know as well, and that includes John Donne and George Herbert. And then you're getting poetry that's, as good as Shakespeare, but it's about God, and it's about your relationship with God and the Christian life day by day. And that really struck me as a Christian. Like, here's guys that are, in the academy are respected as, they're the great poets of what we call religious lyric.
Right.
And they're Christian ministers, and they're using Calvinist themes, biblical themes to talk about their relationship with God. So that's when I thought of reading George Herbert and seeing him take little parables or, create these little experiences for you about prayer or about, devotion to God. And he's not a like Sunday school sweet. He's at times he's got a poem called The Collar where he's just raging. He's angry.
Yeah.
God, where's the fruit? What's going on?
Right.
So he's like David that way, very psalm-like, but again, doing something new for his own time and applying lots of biblical ideas to English people in 1620.
Right.
But it still applies to us.
Right.
That's when it was John Donne and George Herbert. I said, I think I want to write my dissertation on this guy. And he's got this collection called The Temple. Yeah. But in the middle of that is the church, and it's 164 lyric poems, all about his own experience with God, and it's some of the greatest. It's the greatest devotional poetry in English language.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah. So then Milton, you asked about Milton.
Yes.
Milton's Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Is taking the Bible story from creation to the end and turning it into an epic.
Right.
So that's pretty striking to try to do that, and then to do it in a way that people have recognized is valuable, not only for seeing the big biblical story in a new way, again, updating it, telling it to modern people, starting with Satan's rebellious character, and then showing how the Son of God, ultimately triumphs, and how God uses all evil for good. It's this grand story, Adam and Eve in the garden, his characters speaking to each other. He creates all of this to sort of fill out and amplify what we have in Scripture. So that was the striking thing for John Milton and George Herbert, was seeing how they're, as Christians, using biblical ideas and applying it to the Christian life.
Amazing. Well, next time you see them, tell them to say hello. I'm curious though, do you remember a moment in your life that poetry really came alive to you for the first time? Do you remember that first poem, perhaps, or just that moment it clicked, that there was something to poetry that you wanted to explore further?
Yeah. I think it was teachers more than it was particular poems. So I had these two eccentric teachers at the University of Dallas. They both passed away. They were kind of in their prime, or a little past their prime perhaps, but they were these old sages. This guy named Dr. Maurer, who had these big glasses, very skinny, always wore a suit, always smoking, terrible teeth, but he knew so many poems, and he was like a walking poem. He would quote poetry from all different languages. Wow. He knew poetry in several languages, and he would talk about W.H. Auden and Robert Frost all the time. And so I think the teacher, connected me to these poems and made me love those two poets. He showed me how to love them. And then it was Dr. Cowan, who was one of the founders of the Great Books program and the Great Books movement. Yeah. And she was maybe like in her mid-80s at the time. She also had big glasses. She was basically legally blind.
Wow.
If someone would walk her around campus. Wow. But she would come up to you and say, "You need this poem. You need to read this book, Lennox. You must read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. You need it."
Yeah.
It wasn't that it was this fluffy thing that's extra.
Yeah.
You have to have these.
Right.
And it's kind of annoying sometimes. But she made both of those teachers made me think poetry is not just frosting on the cake. It is. It's the substance of life. You need it.
Right.
And they convinced me of that. So I think it was the things they loved. Like Dr. Cowan loved the sonnets of Shakespeare. She had very strong opinions, like 116. Let us not. I can't remember the. We'll lose the opening.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
Let us not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. This opening, it's read at weddings.
Right.
She said, "That's not Shakespeare." She hated it. She had these very strong opinions, and we loved her for that.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Maurer, he would walk around, he'd be lecturing, and then he'd just start thinking about something, kind of annoying, and he'd look out the window, and then he'd come back. Like he had this love for poetry that really shaped who he was.
Yeah.
Not that they were great, perfect people.
Right.
They were great teachers.
Right.
But I think it was those kind of, it's the teacher who connected me to the poems. And as a teacher now, I have to think about what kind of poems can I connect my students with?
Right.
And they might remember, oh, Dr. Grizer loved that poem.
Right.
He introduced me to Frost, and now I have this affinity for Frost. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of weight, maybe as teachers, we need to think about how do we show them how to love poetry, because there's not a lot of people doing that anymore. Right. Maybe it's a difficult thing to teach.
Yeah.
And then maybe the next level is to teach them to try to write some of their own.
Yes.
And see it from the inside. So those were things that it was the teachers that connected me to the poems. As I've thought about it a little bit, more than just I could probably think of moments where I read poems that grabbed me, but it was by teachers kind of illuminating these poems to me. Yeah. And I already liked the teachers, and I saw how to shape them, and then it was passed on to me, and I passed that on to my kids and to my students.
That's incredible. One thing you just said a moment ago is teaching them to love poetry. Yeah. You're aiming directly at their affections with that. How do you do that? Do you put on eccentric clothing yourself and wear a big, I don't know what that looks like, but what does it look like to help your students love poetry? Yeah.
Maybe the costume would help, and get up on the desk and jump up and down.
I can help you invest in one, buy one, just let me know.
Anything to get their attention and hold it, right? Because you say things and then they forget them sometimes, and I told you twice. That's finding a way to connect with modern students about poetry is a challenge. A lot of distractions. Yes. But I think I try to take that lesson I learned from Dr. Cowan and Dr. Maurer, that it's not an extra. You need this, and it's a serious endeavor just to study poetry, and it's difficult. And some people, obviously, if you start trying to read Shakespeare or Milton, it's not super easy. Yeah. There are other poems that are more accessible. We can maybe talk about some of those.
Sure. Yes.
And maybe even read some poems today. But
that'd be great.
Yeah. But so I think reading poems with the students. We do a class where I do a lecture, try to introduce them to the topics at hand and some of the technical aspects of poetry, like how metaphor works, or how images work in poetry, speaking to the senses, putting pictures in your head, and all this. So we work through some of the technical things, but then we have the recitation later in the week, where we sit around the table in small groups and actually read poems out loud and talk about them.
That's great.
I think that's the way to go. Is not just you could overanalyze poetry. Yeah. You could make poetry effeminate. Right. But a lot of contemporary poetry, we think of the poet. Right. It's not masculine. Yes. So I try to push against all of that. Yeah. And the poems we read, the poets we read, these are manly poems. Yes. And there's a lot to offer there. So reading them together. And we all learn from each other. Yes. Like you read a poem, you'd have certain things that you would see. We could talk about those, and then I read it, I see things, and we all share that experience. And I think the NSA small group discussion thing really helps a lot, because reading poetry on your own could be until you develop a taste for it. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's like drinking alone. It's not a good thing.
Right. Exactly. I'm curious to know, how do you know when your student has got it? when they've really grasped what it is that you want them to know. What does an ideal student who's been through Jayson Grieser's class look like?
Well, they can pass the exam. there are the kind of nuts and bolts that they have to do that. But I think they'll say things like, "I didn't understand poetry, or why it mattered. Now I do."
Right. Yeah.
That's very rewarding when I hear that. Or I always thought poetry was this, and now I see it's more important than I thought. I need to read a lot more poetry. This is just the beginning. That's what I want them to say.
Right.
They say, "Okay, yeah, I've read poetry. I'm done with that. I'm selling my books," and then I failed.
Right.
But if this is just the beginning for me, I've got a lot of poetry to read. I'm going to keep reading these poems that you introduced me to. Then I know I've succeeded. If they're enchanted by the language, they're enchanted by what they learned.
Right.
If they leave saying, "I don't think I need that," then I need to find another job.
Right.
Failed. Yeah.
Well, I think so far from the students I've met, you seem to have been very successful in that.
Well, taken a long time, but over the years, kind of learned a lot more poetry myself. Like this time teaching it, this is probably the 10th year I've had this lyric class. Wow. Added more poems, added new poems, took things in new directions, and so it's an ongoing work. But I do get those comments. Students say, "Now I understand poetry. Now I appreciate poetry," and that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, poetry has been a very important part of Western civilization for centuries. I'm curious to know the ways that you think it has very specifically shaped Western civilization. What role has poetry played in the shaping of Western civilization?
Yeah, well, there's the large narratives, whether it's like the Aeneid or the Dante's Commedia, these massive works that have shaped us in ways I don't think we even recognize anymore. But then there's smaller poems, maybe less grand, but all of it. If you think about the way people studied, if you're going to go to Oxford or something like that, if you're John Donne, you do that at a very young age, and you'd study Latin and Greek poetry.
Right.
And just how that would shape your mind.
Yes.
It's probably hard for us to imagine. But I think we can do, even if you don't have Latin and Greek, you can do that with English poetry. And if you start reading, if you put yourself on a diet of reading, like you said, the 101 Calvinist poems, if you started reading through that, each one of those poems, there's a little commentary that I wrote to help you get into the poem.
Yeah.
Try that for a couple of weeks, and I think you'll start seeing things differently, and you'll see how it shapes you.
Right.
And then if a whole culture is doing that, you can imagine how it would shape the entire culture.
Amazing.
So it's a kind of a sophistication with language, grasping the kind of subtleties of language. Like we'll read some poems here in a minute, but there's so many layers here that a young person can understand it in one way.
Right.
You and I can understand it another way.
Yeah.
And then, there's even like a scholar who spent his whole life studying this one poet would understand it at another level. And it just seems like there's more there for everyone always. There's always more to get out of it.
Right.
Apply it to new things, see it in new ways. So poetry, I think, teaches you to see the world in this more, because of the fall, I think we tend to be alienated from the world around us. I think poetry, part of what lyric poetry does anyway, is kind of, it uses a lot of garden imagery. It's like we're trying to get back to the innocence that we lost, or we're trying to understand our relationship to things around us, and in some cases to God. And so poetry is a way of, like, metaphors connecting things that are pulled apart, and maybe those things should be together, and we should see things how they connect. Yeah. So it's breaking down that alienation and breaking down the kind of utilitarian way we go through life, and we don't appreciate the beauty around us and the truth around us and the goodness around us. And so it enchants you. So if you have a people that are shaped by that, and maybe lots of poets writing poetry, I think you're going to see that we'd be a much deeper people. Yeah. And it's got to be obviously connected to a robust Christianity. Right. Or it could just be praising the wrong things. But if it's praising the world God made, illuminating our own experience in that world, and then in some cases directly praising our God and drawing us closer to Him. That's going to shape an entire culture.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of which, I actually want to get right into this poetry and get into reading it, and then we can analyze each. So I think we've got 4 poems today.
Right.
Let's get into them. I don't know which one you want to start with.
Yeah, we'll just go in order here.
Yeah, sounds good.
I picked these. They're sort of chronological order. So the earliest of the poems that we have is Shakespeare's Sonnet,
Fantastic.
number 12.
Yeah.
And this is When I Do Count the Clock That Tells the Time. So he wrote a whole sequence of sonnets, and this is number 12. I like this one because it's so concrete. It shows you how great Shakespeare can be with all these images, all these things you could touch, all these things you could experience in your own locality.
Yes.
Also because it's about the seasons and about time in a very profound way. So let's look at this and then we can talk about it. When I do count the clock that tells the time and see the brave day sunk in hideous night, when I behold the violet past prime and sable curls all silvered o'er with white, with lofty trees I see barren of leaves, which erst from heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green all girded up in sheaves, borne on the bier with white and bristly beard. Then of thy beauty do I question make, that thou amongst the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. And nothing against time's scythe can make defense, save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about in this class when we read this just this past term. Talked a lot about how time attacks beauty, time destroys beauty,
right?
And in a way, the lyric poem is trying to preserve that beauty. Now, the first tack the poet here takes is to try to get this beautiful. It's a beautiful young man who's like an aristocrat, and he's like he's the bee's knees. He's everything, and he's saying you're going to die, and you're not going to pass that beauty on. Best way to do it would be to have children. Right. Wow. So why don't you? He says breeding.
Yes.
It's pretty shocking.
Yes.
I like to read this with students, and like first thing he's saying is get married and have some children. Okay. Maybe we need to hear that today. Right. A lot of young people they're not thinking about getting married. So there's some practical here.
Absolutely.
And then there's the whole carpe diem idea.
Yes.
That gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying.
Right.
That same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. So that time is always passing, and these sonnets capture the seasons turning, and your life is like a season. Like I'm getting old. I feel that. Right. Time is going by. But let's analyze this a little bit. Yeah. So you have the clock right at the beginning, and I do count the clock that tells the time. Beautiful alliterations. Right. Feels almost like a clock. Feels like time moving. Right. You picked up on that. Yes. You have the day sinking down into night. You have the violet going past its prime. Right.
Yes.
We just think that's no big deal. But think about that. You have the flower, and then it's fading.
Yeah.
What does that say? What is that showing you? The beauty, that beautiful rose is going to fade. Right. It's part of the fall. Yeah. It's part of beauty. Yeah. Beauty fading right in front of us, and we just say, Shakespeare wants us to think about that a little bit. And then it's like all of the garden that you grow. At the end of the season, you gotta take all that out, pull all that out, put it up in a sheaf, and carry it off, and dump it at the recycling center or whatever you do with it. Right. He likens it to like it's all born on a bier. It's like carrying out a dead body. All of summer's green. I really like the image here of the trees, the lofty trees. Yeah. You catch on this one, right? The lofty trees barren of leaves, which before did canopy the herd. What a wonderful verb there, but there was this canopy, all the herd was under there, and now it's all gone. Yeah. And like the herd's gone, and the season has passed. So again, all these are concrete ways of talking about time passing and the abstraction of time. Here we actually experience it. Yeah. A different season. Winter is now here in a sense. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's right. Yeah. And then that seasonal thing applies to our own lives, right? You might be my students. I say you're in the summer of your life. You're young, or spring even. Yes. But then you go on to winter and old age. Yeah. And there's a strength that comes with youth. There's beauty that comes with youth. I think they recognize that there's something here for them. And then at the end, it's, more of a universal statement here. Thou must among the wastes of time must go. He's talking to this individual. But then, since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake, and die as fast as they see others grow. So there's things coming up. Yes. Time is making things beautiful, but time's also taking things down. Right. And they're losing their beauty and their sweetness. So that, I think that's it's one I haven't memorized this one. It's one to memorize, and it's very, as you say, it sounds amazing, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's another, there's a whole sequence of sonnets like that where he's talking about time and how time destroys beauty. And time is sort of this image with a scythe who comes in and cuts things down, whether it's men or flowers or beautiful things. Another one that we could look at is, I mentioned in my own reading of poetry, I went from Shakespeare to the metaphysical poets. Yes. Here's one by George Herbert called Virtue. It's really important to think about what the title might mean.
Yes.
On the sonnets of Shakespeare, he didn't actually give them titles, so that's just the first line.
Right.
This one, Herbert always does clever things with his titles. So it's called Virtue. And Virtue, he knew Latin and Greek. He's lived at the time when every boy going to university would have studied Latin and Greek.
Yes.
He's thinking about, vir, strength, manly strength, virtue. But also more generally, virtue as in what is the thing that we most value in our character. Let me read this one. It's a shorter one. Well, I guess it's about the same length, but it's laid out differently. It's not a sonnet. Sweet day, so cool, so calm, so bright, the bridal of the earth and sky. The dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. Sweet rose, whose hue angry and brave bids the rash gazer wipe his eye. Thy root is ever in thy grave, ever in its grave, and thou must die. Sweet spring, full of sweet days and roses, a box where sweets compacted lie. My music shows ye have your closes, and all must die. Only a sweet and virtuous soul, like seasoned timber, never gives, but though the whole world turn to coal, then chiefly lives. So, the bridal of the earth and sky. It's a beautiful day. It's like the wedding of the earth and sky. Yes. But the dew shall weep thy fall tonight, for thou must die. That beautiful day is going to die. Shakespeare said something very similar in the last one, didn't he? He said, the brave day sunk in hideous night. Every day dies. So we get this, again, this time is moving. Time is going forward. Time is going to make things die. Thou must die. Then the rose, the root. You think of a rose, beautiful rose, but its root is already in the grave, he's saying. Okay. Sweet spring. It's spring is this lovely time when it's like a box of sweets. Right. You must die as well.
Yes.
Only a virtuous soul. Then he shifts to, by the way, if we had time, we could look at how the rhyme scheme for the first three all matches up, and then he shifts to a different rhyme scheme.
Yeah.
Instead of, we have sky, die, I, die, lie, die. Now he goes to gives, lives. Changes the rhyming just a little bit to set off this fourth stanza. And you notice the last, you get all must die, or sorry, for thou must die, and thou must die, and all must die, then chiefly lives.
Wow.
Turns it at the end. He loves to, at the very end, turn the poem in a new direction. Seasoned timber. It's kind of an interesting image. We could probably write a whole paper about that.
Yeah.
But if it's seasoned, it reminds me of just a life where you've been seasoned by suffering.
Right.
He writes a lot about suffering, affliction, hard things that God has brought into his life. But here it's a seasoning. It's he's seeing the fruit of it, and then the whole if the whole world were to burn up, your soul would still be this seasoned thing. Right. And at the resurrection, you're like, you're going to last. Yes. That's the thing that lasts. That's the thing that has the great strength in the end.
Absolutely.
Surprisingly, comparing the soul to seasoned timber, which is a strange image, right? But it's a brilliant image because it's giving off this fragrance, perhaps the seasoning of his life.
Yes.
It's always there, and it always will be there. So, beautiful poem, powerful poem.
Yeah, very hopeful poem as
well.
It
is.
Yeah,
it is.
Death, resurrection. You see those themes there. Very
you see,
profound.
he's not. Sorry to interrupt, but it's not like saccharine sweet.
Right.
You make Herbert, he writes about Sunday school lessons. His art is exquisite here.
This is about life.
It's about life, the deep things.
There's a way in which, when you understand this, especially having lived a life. I mean, it's kind of going back to something you said earlier. I wonder how a young person would read this compared to the way an older person would read this. There's a sense in which I think a younger person would read this and have something to aspire to. An older person would read this, and I guess assuming they've lived a life of virtue, would be grateful and appreciative of the different seasons of life.
I love that. And like you said, hopeful.
Yeah. Yes.
Like all this has purpose.
Right.
Herbert writes in a very purposeful way.
Yeah, I love it.
Very good. I love it too.
So this next one is God's Grandeur.
Yes. So now we're moving on into going on from the metaphysical poets to Victorian poet Hopkins. But he wrote in such a forward-looking way. He was a very experimental poet that he really wasn't popular. And he didn't even publish during his lifetime. He kind of saved his poems for himself and his friends. But later on, poets like T.S. Eliot in the modern period, like 1920s, used Hopkins as a way of promoting a resurgence of poetry and a reforming of poetry. So he was actually Victorian, but he became popular in the modern period, like around World War II, World War I, World War II. So there was a collection of poets that T.S. Eliot put together, and he gave Hopkins like one of the most pages in that book because he thought this is a way to kind of revive poetry.
Yes.
So this one, if you've never heard Hopkins, just hearing him can change everything for you. You're like, what is that? I've never heard anything like that. This is called God's Grandeur.
Yeah.
The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. And wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. One line to make sure that you understand, our listeners understand here, is that wreck his rod means to submit to. So if you get that line can throw you off.
Right.
Why do men then now not submit to his rod, wreck his rod? You can see he loves Anglo-Saxon language. He's using a lot of alliteration, very heavy alliteration, which I really enjoy here. Charged with the grandeur of God. There's alliteration there. He uses
from shook foil.
Shining from shook foil. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? All single syllable words. It's like, I love that line. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? It's really fun to say. And then we get words like trod. This Anglo-Saxon word. Generations have trod.
Right.
That kind of weariness.
Also very descriptive of motion. Like you hear the motion, you feel the motion. Yeah.
And it's the motion of like almost like an animal, right? It's not thinking, it's not connecting with nature. But then he says, for all this that we might do to nature and how we might, it's bleared, smeared, we miss the deeper things. It's never gone, right? It's for all this nature's never spent. And that's the whole point of that things will flame out, like glory will flame out, or oil will squirt out in places you didn't expect, because God's world is charged with his glory.
Wow.
And it's our job to find it, right?
Yes.
So the Holy Ghost, in the end, the Holy Ghost is always brooding over the world like he was at creation. Every day is a new day. Every day is the Holy Ghost working. So as you said earlier about the Herbert poem, this is a very hopeful poem.
Right.
The world's not abandoned. God didn't leave the world behind. He's constantly at work in it, and it's charged with glory all the time.
Yeah.
Nature can never be destroyed, is what he's saying there. And it's almost like a Flannery O'Connor kind of view.
Yes.
Where expect good things to happen, or expect surprising things to happen, because that's the world God's made.
This is deeply theological. I mean, I love this. It's actually quite profound to me.
Yeah.
God's glory cannot be diminished, you know?
Yeah.
And even just the way it ends, talking about the Holy Ghost being present there, is that his presence in what he's created can also never really be diminished.
Right.
That's pretty profound on the backdrop of people who sort of have this entropic view of the world. But a poem like this just helps us recognize that God's glory will last forever, you know?
Exactly. And we might say that in a kind of abstract way, but here he says it in such a memorable way.
He really does.
Right. This is another one
Really
I think we should memorize and know. It's the sound of it is delightful. And then the content, as you said, we need the content. We need to think about this. And it re-enchants us to the world.
That's incredible.
One more.
Yes.
This is one listeners, viewers may not have come across. These other ones are more popular, but I think this one is just wonderful.
Yes.
The Aim Was Song by Robert Frost. Before man came to blow it right, the wind once blew itself untaught and did its loudest day and night in any rough place where it caught. Man came to tell it what was wrong. It hadn't found the place to blow. It blew too hard. The aim was song, and listen how it ought to go. He took a little in his mouth, held it long enough for north to be converted into south, and then by measure blew it forth. By measure. It was word and note. The wind was meant to be. A little through the lips and throat. The aim was song. The wind could see. So this is a little parable.
Yeah.
But you see how it puts man. It's almost I'd say it's a Christian view of man's place in nature.
Right.
Man is to teach the world, or man is to take dominion over the world. It says the wind was meant to be.
Yeah.
Right. The wind is meant to be music. It's meant to be what we're doing right now.
Yes.
Right. We're using wind.
That's right.
To speak. We're using wind to read this poem, and this is all measured language.
Yeah.
This is like wind that Frost has captured.
Yes.
And turned into something beautiful.
Yes.
So it's really it's about poetry.
Wow.
That's what poetry is.
Word becoming flesh.
Yeah, exactly. And then your language becoming song.
Yes.
And your breath becoming song. It's marvelous.
Incredible.
Very simple. His language is so simple, and yet it's so deep. It's very clear water, but deep water. And this is what we were talking about earlier, accessible. Like I could hear that. I don't get all of it, but I got a lot of it, and I recognize there's something there.
Yeah.
I love that. And then when you go back and read it a few more times, you can try to, even memorizing lines you might not fully understand.
Right.
Memorize it. You'll be thinking about it a couple weeks later. I think I know what that means.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So don't be put off by a line that's difficult, but Frost is so good that he can at least give you most of it very accessible, even though he's doing something pretty profound here.
Wow.
So I love his simple language.
This is incredible. I love this. I'm just amazed again at just how I think theology's really been confined to this sort of high intellectual academic sort of area.
Yeah.
But there's just a profound way that poetry is able to understand God, understand the world he's created, understand ourselves with just that much great, like with accuracy and with the beauty that makes it compelling, right?
Right.
I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Can I do one more thing
so rich.
before we go?
Take your time.
That's what you're saying there about poetry. This is a poem I wrote, and I just want to say that there's a way in which not only reading poetry but trying to write poetry can also shape you. And even if you're not, like I'm not a professional poet, but I say, all right, you students, you're going to write a poem. I'm going to write one with you.
Nice.
Okay, so and I think what we've fallen into, Lennox, is that we take pictures of everything with our phones, and we think, I've captured it.
Right.
But you see how poetry is a much deeper capturing of what's going on.
Right.
And so when you try to take something of your own life, like one time I wrote a poem about going to a pig roast, or maybe you go to a wedding and something happens. I want to go think about that.
Yes.
And you just start writing out ideas or experience, trying to put your experience into words. Right. So it's a wonderful experience to try to do. I don't know if you've maybe written stories, songs. You probably have.
Yeah.
Right. And there's
Poems,
something
actually.
Okay. Very good.
Yes.
So that the creative process where the poem just kind of leads you. it's a wonderful experience. So this is one I wrote with my students about the seasons changing.
Beautiful.
And my yard is full of these beautiful apples.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was struck by that. They're so beautiful.
Wow.
There's sweetness in those apples. So, and the seasons are starting to change.
Yes.
So I was thinking about how these poems are capturing time changing.
Yes.
So it's called Apple Falls.
Okay.
All right. Thud, thud, thud on the deadening earth, oh fall. All the summer sweetness now in a red and yellow ball. These apples like signal lights on the sea. I toss them to my dog or collect them in large pots and feed them to my hog. They speak of summer's exiting. They hold the rose in perfume, holding within their globes the sweet that's entering the tomb. Like a violin's sad strain, they dot the yard with notes. It's a song that I ignore, still dreaming summer hopes. Thud, thud, thud on the darkening earth, oh fall. See summer sweetness go in a red and yellow ball.
Wow. Yeah.
So there's
That's incredible.
That season,
Yeah.
the season's ending, and you just want to say something
Yes.
about it.
Yes.
And this, I don't know, there's something meaningful about just trying to capture it.
Yeah.
Capture that experience that I had in my yard. What are these things?
Yes. Yeah.
Something wonderful about
beautiful.
trying to put it in your own words.
That is beautiful. Yeah. You seem to like alliteration in poetry. I see you using that in English as well. Yeah. It's
one of my classes I teach is Middle English, and we read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in Middle English, and it's alliterative Anglo-Saxon style poetry. So that's really kind of captured me and shaped the way I approach language.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, Jayson, you've got 5 sons.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've ever employed poetry in their upbringing, or just the kinds of things that you'd put in their way as they pursue this virtuous masculinity in any way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
Okay. I fully expect that of you.
Yeah. It's not like they're poetry nerds or anything, but they know certain poems that we learned as they were little. We do we called it a poetry party. I call it a poetry party. Yeah. Saturday morning, we would read a poem together, and then I'd give them special donuts or something to kind of sweeten the deal. But poems like maybe some people out there some poems that start with like The Eagle, real short little poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson about an eagle. And I think my boys, we could all recite it. It's very short. We memorized that one. The Lamb by William Blake, one that we memorized. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, Robert Frost. These are poems that, all my boys know, and so they appreciate poetry. Again, they're not going to say, "Oh yeah, I've read Shakespeare sonnets straight through" or anything like that. But we made poetry a part of our life together, and stories. Yes. Like Tolkien and Lewis, obviously, and then we read. There's a book called The Top 500 Poems. That's one that I use in my class, and I would just kind of mark certain ones that I thought these would be accessible to my boys, and even to me. If you're not, some of these people are not teachers of poetry, so I think starting with yourself, find some poems that you like, you care about. Think about them for a while, internalize them, maybe memorize them, and then introduce them to your kids, and they're going to see, oh, Dad likes this. Dad likes this poem. Maybe I should.
Nice. Yeah.
I think that's where it starts.
That's special. Do you write henna poetry at all?
I did. Yeah, I have.
Nice.
I have. It's been a while, but I maybe I should more. But in the early days, yes, I certainly did.
That's beautiful. You mentioned Tolkien a minute ago.
Yeah.
And I've just had this curiosity. In fact, at the moment, I'm actually back in The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Really enjoying it. Doing a slow read, but just really trying to pay more attention to everything. And one of the things I'm paying attention to is the poetry that Tolkien uses. I mean, there's poetry for absolutely everything in that book. Yeah. And I'm just curious to know, like, how crucial is that poetry to the whole universe of Middle Earth? I've even wondered if you removed all the prose and just left the poetry, would it still tell the same story? I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it is essential to the world that he's created.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a great picture of how poetry should affect our own lives.
Yes.
Like you said, poetry about everything.
Right.
You could write poetry about taking a bath. You
Yes,
know?
right.
He would do that, or poetry about kids playing in the bath.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
dinner plates. You know, he writes poetry about everything,
Right.
and it's all kind of lighthearted and accessible. It's rhyming and enjoyable poetry. It's a great model for and a lot of you know, grade school kids will memorize those poems at Logos and recite them for speech meet.
Right.
Why? Well, they're delightful, right? If poetry, that's one of the definitions of poetry: teaches and delights. And if it's modern poetry that doesn't delight you, then don't read it. Find something else. There's plenty of poetry out there that will delight you.
Absolutely.
And Tolkien's a master at that.
Yeah, he really is.
He's a great example.
Yeah, I think Tolkien was just gifted with this ability for language and literature, and just
definitely.
you know,
Absolutely.
I hope we can produce more of those kinds of people. Even
Yes, that's what we're trying to do, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, are there any modern poets that you appreciate at all?
Yeah, there's some that I appreciate. And you're talking about like right now?
Yes, right now.
Living right now?
Yes, living right now.
Well, Richard Wilbur is not living right now, but he just died recently, so we'll say that he is. But
right.
He was Richard Wilbur is an American poet, and he's very he would be I think at the very high level.
Yes.
He's using the older forms in new ways. So when you get into the kind of free verse poetry,
Yes.
Like I said before, I can appreciate some of that, but it's often less accessible. It doesn't grab your ear like the older forms do. But we got to take those old forms and use them in new ways. And
Yes.
Richard Wilbur's a guy who did that. Maybe a good poem to start would be "Praise in Summer." It's one I memorized a while back. I love that poem.
Okay.
And it's all about how you might think you need to like distort the world to see its beauty, and then in the end, it turns out the world itself is already glorious.
Wow.
And it kind of does this reversal at the end, like almost like the Hopkins poem or the Herbert poem. It's there's, you know, poetry is about surprise, and in the surprise that we miss
Right.
when we're just kind of going through our daily routine. We need to remember, I mean, we need to be surprised, and great poets do that. So there's a good example of someone today. There's like Seamus Heaney, you know, who did the Beowulf translation, and he's an Irish poet, and he's still alive and writing books of poems. And
Yes.
there's others out there, but I don't think we have like greats like Milton and Shakespeare. If they're out there, we don't know about them. They're not popular, but probably just because we don't have the cultural, you know, the culture that's shaping men like that right now. So that's what we're trying to rebuild. That's going to take some time.
No, for sure. So for those who are new to poetry, maybe they've heard you speak today, and they're now interested in reading poetry for themselves. Is there just one poem that you'd recommend for them to go and read that would be a great entryway into the world of poetry?
Yeah, I would recommend the Eagle, by Alfred Lord Tennyson.
Yes.
And I've seen that even at the beginning of, there's a book called Sound and Sense, which is an introduction to poetry. That's very good. Get one of the older ones. The newer editions are probably ruined by the modern or postmodern ideas, but the older ones are full of great poems before they revise it, take all the good stuff out. But that book starts with that poem, and that gave me the idea to try to start with that with my boys. And it's about an eagle, but it also gives you the experience. You know, he clasps the crags with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Just that little poem. Yeah, it's just 6 lines. But if you analyze the sounds, think about the sounds, and then, you know, it shows you how poetry is different from a dictionary definition of an eagle.
Right.
This is more about the majesty of it. How do you capture the majesty of it and the strangeness of an eagle? And for a moment, you feel like you're up there with the eagle, diving down with the eagle. So that's a great one to start with. If you want something a little more difficult, maybe Pied Beauty by Hopkins.
Okay.
Pied, Pied Beauty. It's all about nature and the beauty of nature and God's glory. So those are 2 I'd start with.
Beautiful. Well, Jayson, this has been incredible. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. This has been a rich conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Lennox. It's been great being on.
Appreciate this. Yeah.